In the middle of the hospital corridor, under the astonished gazes of nurses and patients, the young mistress, seized by an arrogant jealousy, suddenly lifted her leg and threw a direct kick into the pregnant wife's stomach. The cruel blow made her fall to her knees on the cold tile floor, clutching her belly in pain, her eyes clouded with tears and humiliation. The arrogant tycoon just stood there, blind to the truth, unaware that the entire scene was being witnessed by the hospital's chief of staff, who also happened to be the wronged woman's uncle. In an instant, the balance of power shifted. What was about to unfold was no longer a simple lover's quarrel, but an implacable judgment that would make everyone tremble. The afternoon sun cast a long, golden light over Boston's Copley Square, which was showing off its best spring face. The sidewalk cafes were filled with quiet conversation. The clinking of porcelain cups mixed with the sound of a lone saxophone drifting from a street corner, and the air smelled of freshly ground coffee and pastries dusted with powdered sugar. At the center of this urban stage, Ethan Hayes felt like the master of his own universe. He wore an impeccable suit, a wrinkle-free shirt, and a sober tie. He greeted international clients with a confidence that bordered on vanity, and when he raised his glass for a toast, he seemed to be toasting the entire city. A waiter brought him a glass of house Cabernet. He took a sip, nodded his approval, and turned back to the two investors who were listening, captivated, as he described his future luxury condo developments along the Charles River. Yet, an air of emptiness surrounded him. Material success without human warmth, a prelude to the coming storm. The investors spoke of figures, of blueprints, of the timeless beauty of the brownstones, and Ethan claimed that Boston was a guaranteed investment. He smiled without raising his voice, certain he had an answer for everything. At an adjacent table, two elderly ladies commented that spring had come in clearer than usual this year, that the Boston Marathon would be upon them soon, and that the square would be resplendent with banners and flowers. The conversation drifted like the sunlight on the gilded facades. A waiter discreetly left the check at another table and received a standard 20% tip, as was the local custom. Ethan, attentive to every detail, was also generous with the waiters. Not out of kindness, some thought, but because it was another way to assert his status in front of everyone. At that moment, Victoria Vance emerged through the maze of tables, dressed in a light spring suit with a silk scarf tied at her neck, her stride firm with the self-awareness of her own effect. She greeted the clients with the natural ease of a marketing director who moves like a fish in water between numbers and confidences. Ethan's eyes lit up. With a slanted smile, she joked about the company's next ad campaign and how the square would serve as the perfect backdrop to unveil the new project. The investors laughed. Victoria, without effort, became the center of attention. She spoke with wit, measured her silences, and let Ethan's words sound even more important as they landed on the foundation of her own confidence. Claire Hayes arrived a few minutes later, without fanfare. She had stopped by a florist on Newbury Street and was carrying a small bouquet of peonies and lilac. The delicate perfume accompanied her as she moved carefully, one hand on her belly, the other protecting the paper-wrapped flowers. She was 7 months pregnant, and hope had drawn soft lines on her face. She had spent the morning at her job in the maternity unit at Massachusetts General Hospital. Afterward, she had printed the most recent sonogram and tucked it into a white envelope. She wanted to surprise her husband. She had considered going to his office first, but something pulled her toward the square. Boston invited you to walk, to breathe slowly, to see with clear eyes. She sat for a moment at the edge of a cafe patio, asked for a glass of water, and thanked the waitress with a smile. The waitress wished her luck with the pregnancy and told her she was glowing. Claire felt as if the whole city were embracing her. Then she stood up, scanned the crowd, and found Ethan. She saw him surrounded by clients, watched intently by Victoria, and listened to with a respect that seemed disproportionate to Claire. She approached without interrupting, ready to wait for the right moment. Ethan spoke of solvency, of agile timelines, of his team as if it were a finely tuned orchestra. Victoria nodded, completing a sentence here and there, and this sum of gestures created a picture Claire didn't remember seeing before. It wasn't just work, nor was it an innocent joke. Above all, it was a complicity, When the investors asked for another round, Victoria suggested a photo for social media. Ethan obliged, settling in beside her, smiling in his triumph mode. Claire gently squeezed the bouquet, careful not to bruise the stems. She didn't want to be rash. She observed her husband's face and found it distant. She recognized that professional expression she had always admired, but now it seemed like a thick mask. The waiter arrived with 3 glasses of wine. Victoria brushed Ethan's arm as she thanked him for the trust he was placing in her for the campaign. The touch was light, almost accidental, and yet it ignited an alarm in Claire's chest. The square continued its music. A group of university students hurried past toward one of the campuses. A child let out a sharp laugh as a balloon slipped from his hand and rose between the balconies. An older couple shared a scone and affectionately debated the best recipe for clam chowder. Claire took a breath and looked for the moment to approach. When she did, Ethan took a second to look at her. A small second, but large enough for her heart to register the pause. He said her name with a cordiality that sounded formal. The investors greeted her as if she were just another guest. Victoria looked at her with polite curiosity and an appraising glint. Claire smiled. She said she was just passing by and wanted to say hello. She wanted to touch her husband's arm, but he was already explaining a map on the table. She withdrew her hand quietly and remembered the purse where she kept the envelope with the sonogram. She told herself this wasn't the right time. She would go to the office later, perhaps when the clients and cameras were gone. For Claire, hope was a form of courtesy. She managed to hold on to it even when she noticed that Ethan, when introducing Victoria, used one adjective too many. He described her as brilliant. It wasn't an exaggerated compliment, but he pronounced it with a warmth he hadn't used to ask about Claire's fatigue or about the baby girl growing inside her. Victoria asked for permission to sit next to Claire for a moment. She complimented the bouquet with a hint of faint irony and then commented, perhaps with good intentions, that a 7-month pregnancy demanded more rest than strolls through the square. Claire responded serenely. She said her doctor was monitoring her closely, that she walked slowly, and that everything was going well. Victoria smiled, that half-moon smile that doesn't reach the eyes. She returned to her chair, took out her phone, and showed a presentation for the company's next event. She spoke of color schemes, of camera angles, of the city as a stage. Ethan nodded. Their voices seemed to capture the afternoon light and mold it to their advantage. Claire felt the sweet weight of exhaustion on her shoulders. A breeze swirled from the arcades and moved Victoria's scarf as if it were a small flag. The square seemed to be applauding those who took center stage. Claire knew she didn't want to compete for a role in that performance. She came from another, more intimate play, made of hospital corridors, of hands that cradle, of heartbeats heard through headphones. She thought that life never pits different shows against each other for someone to win. It pits them against each other to reveal who you are when the curtain falls. She stood up without rushing. Ethan saw her standing with the bouquet and said that as soon as he finished, he would stop by the office. Claire accepted with a gracious nod. She didn't demand anything. It wasn't her style to ask for attention in front of others. She knew that true love is recognized when there is no audience. She blew a kiss in the air, a small goodbye that wouldn't interrupt business, and walked toward the edge of the square. People continued to drink coffee. Spoons clinked against saucers. An old man adjusted his baseball cap and looked at the sky with the eyes of someone who has seen many springs and is not surprised that each one hides a storm. Before turning the corner, Claire paused, looked back, and was left with the image of Ethan bathed in golden light. She noticed that her hope hadn't shattered, but it had lost a thread. It was like a fine fabric that has a loose stitch. You can't see it from afar, but the person wearing it feels the rough chafe against their skin. She caressed the paper of the bouquet and thought of the sonogram, of the small figure that could already be clearly discerned. She smiled at that life that chose her every day from within. She held the bouquet against her chest to protect it from the wind and walked toward the street where her taxi was parked. She gratefully greeted the driver who had waited a few minutes for her on the other side of the square. She got in carefully, leaned back, and took a deep breath. The city remained alive behind the glass. A woman pushed a stroller. A young man offered his seat to an elderly lady at a bus stop. A corner store pulled down its security gate with a familiar squeal. The engine purred, and as it pulled away, Claire rested a hand on her belly, as if protecting a treasure and also protecting herself. The afternoon light was fading slowly, leaving not shadows but a soft glow. In that glow, Claire decided she would not jump to any conclusions. She would remain silent until she could speak with her husband alone. She would ask calm questions, and she would expect clear answers. She deserved no less, and her daughter deserved no less than transparency. When the taxi stopped in front of her brownstone, Claire paid with a discreet tip. She climbed the steps slowly, one hand on the railing, opened the door, placed the bouquet in a tall vase, took out the white envelope, and carefully stroked its edge. She sat on the sofa, breathed in the scent of lilac rising from the water, and for the first time all afternoon, she felt a pang of doubt she couldn't name. The living room was silent. The framed photo from her wedding on the bookshelf returned a gleam that now seemed to belong to another era. Claire leaned over the envelope and held it for a moment between her hands, as if an answer depended on that single piece of paper. As Claire caressed the envelope with her daughter's sonogram, she wondered, is there still a place for me in his world? Claire ascended the glass staircase of the Hayes Development Group with a bouquet in her hand and a secret in her heart. She remembered the afternoon in Copley Square, Ethan's polite and distant smile, the way Victoria effortlessly filled every silence with brilliant comments, and that memory made her adjust her pace so her spirit wouldn't falter. She pushed open the glass door with a soft, "Good morning." She heard the gentle hum of the reception area and the continuous murmur of a pod-based coffee machine that left the scent of a recent roast in the air. The office opened before her, bright and luminous, with white walls, gleaming floors, and precisely placed contemporary art. At the far end, a glass wall offered an unobstructed view of Copley Square in its spring attire. An employee walked by with a folder. Another closed his laptop and left a discreet tip on the table for the courier who had just delivered some picture frames. This familiar rhythm was something Claire now perceived as part of an order that suddenly felt alien to her. She greeted the receptionist with her usual courtesy, asked for a glass of water, adjusted the bouquet of peonies and lilac in her hands, and asked if Ethan was free for a minute. The receptionist, who knew the rhythms of the company well, smiled warmly and said he was in a meeting in the executive conference room, but that she could go in, that he would surely be happy to see her. Claire nodded with silent gratitude and walked down the hallway, where the emergency lights cast reflections on the glass, as if everything were set for a performance. As she neared the room, she heard animated voices, laughter not the sound of last-minute tension, but of the easy complicity that settles in when everything feels like it's going well. She thought it was a good moment that the sonogram inside the white envelope, neatly tucked in her purse, would finally find its place on the table. She placed a hand on her belly in an instinctive gesture of protection, took a deep breath, and pushed the door, which opened with a clean click. The conference room was bathed in morning light. On one side, on a long table, lay folders with development schematics and blueprints printed on glossy paper. On the other, a large monitor displayed photos of historic facades at sunset. At the head of the table, Ethan was finishing an explanation of a delivery timeline with that confident tone that had always fascinated clients. To his right, Victoria listened with her arms relaxed, her fingers toying with a silver pen, her head tilted slightly toward him, in a posture of attentiveness that Claire couldn't help but read with apprehension. There were 3 investors, a legal advisor, and an operations manager, all looking at Ethan with respect. The scene pulsed with success, and yet Claire's stomach churned, as if the light itself had a sharp edge. Ethan saw her standing in the doorway and said her name cordially. He asked if she wanted to sit, offered her water, and pointed to a chair, all with a measured politeness that Claire knew and valued, though at that moment she would have wished for something less perfect and more personal. She replied that she didn't want to interrupt. She lifted the bouquet with a smile that asked for permission and took 2 steps forward. Victoria then turned with a brief smile and a polite, "Hello," the kind that stays on the surface, neither cold nor warm, just correct. The project timeline was still open on the screen. An investor proposed moving up a presentation event, Victoria spoke of soft colors, afternoon light, a live pianist to add a touch of distinction, and Ethan nodded with satisfaction. Claire looked at her husband's face and found him absorbed in an enthusiasm that did not include her. She told herself it was a matter of timing and looked again at the bouquet as if the flowers held the conversational thread she needed. Then, the simplest and most devastating thing happened. A witty comment from Victoria drew a genuine laugh from Ethan, and in that gesture, he rested his hand on the back of her chair. It was for a second that meant nothing to the room, but for Claire, it was a tolling bell. It wasn't an improper touch. No etiquette book would have censored it. However, it revealed a familiarity that Claire did not expect to see there. She felt her pulse rise like a fast tide. She tried to hold the bouquet steady, but the paper wrapper slipped clumsily through her fingers. A few flowers broke free and scattered on the shiny floor like small, extinguished lights. Ethan cut off his sentence and took a step toward her, as if to help, but he stopped halfway, as if hesitating between attending to his wife and maintaining the flow of the meeting. And that brief hesitation was a door closing in Claire's chest. She bent down to gently pick up the peonies. Her belly got in the way a little, a sharp pain shot through her side, and she leaned on the edge of the table to catch her breath. The legal advisor stood up with good intentions to help her. Victoria stepped forward and, before bending down, let a comment fall that cut like fine glass. She said in a clear voice, without regret or apparent malice, only with that precision that hurts more for its accuracy than its intensity, "You shouldn't be taking so many stairs. You look frail." The phrase hung in the room for a moment, like a ribbon searching for a place to land. The operations manager cleared his throat and looked out the window. One of the investors pretended to check his phone. The receptionist opened the door to ask if she should serve coffee and quickly withdrew her head with the intuition of someone who understands they've walked in on a private scene. Claire slowly straightened her back, held the reassembled bouquet, and gave a grateful look to the advisor who handed her a fallen flower. She said she was fine, that it had just been a sudden movement. Nothing more. In the silence that followed, the chimes from a nearby historic church rang with their ancient slowness, marking the hour as they always had. And that sound reminded Claire that some things remain when everything else falters. Ethan tried to pick up the thread of the meeting, but his voice no longer had the consistency of minutes before. He stated 2 figures. He got a date wrong, and Victoria corrected him with a soft confidence that made the crack more evident. Claire sat for a moment in a nearby chair, clutching the purse where the envelope with the sonogram slept, and promised her own breathing that she would find her calm again. She looked at the paintings on the wall, the geometric lines, the calculated shadows, and thought how different it was from the hospital, with its voices attached to real names, the concrete tenderness of one hand squeezing another. She made a move to stand up. She said she didn't want to disturb them, just as the receptionist appeared with 2 glasses of water and a coffee. Claire took one of the glasses and gave a sincere smile that the woman seemed to understand without words. She then spoke to Ethan, saying she had just stopped by to say hello and would wait for him in his office to show him something. He replied that he would be in as soon as they finished, that it would be quick, that he was excited to see her. She nodded, but the excitement inside her had shrunk like a garment in cold water. The rhythm of the meeting tried to reassemble itself, though every sentence now had a rough edge. In a final attempt at normality, Victoria closed her folder firmly and proposed they return to the agenda. Claire felt another, deeper pang, as if her body were repeating the word careful on its own. She placed an open hand on her belly, and the baby responded with a gentle movement that was both comfort and alarm. She leaned toward the table to pick up her glass, and in that small twist, the room did a slow spin. She felt blood rush to her head with a strange heat. The air grew heavy, the outlines of the room losing their firmness. She thought about going out into the hallway for some air, about returning to the reception area, about sitting for a moment next to the tall plant she had seen by the elevator, but the idea came too late. Her vision filled with spots of light, and the floor seemed to move like a boat. No one said anything grand. The legal advisor barely whispered, "Should we call David?" The receptionist already had her hand on the phone. Ethan took a half step he couldn't complete. Victoria pressed her lips together with a poorly hidden anxiety. Claire closed her eyes to steady herself from within and searched for a firm place to anchor her thoughts. She found her daughter's face, that figure of white and gray ink that hours before had felt like a daily miracle. Then she heard her own voice drop to an almost childish whisper. And though she wanted to keep it to herself, she said it with the faith of someone trying to stop time with words. Claire felt an intense wave of dizziness and whispered to herself, "No, not now. Please, don't let anything happen to my baby." The wail of an ambulance siren shattered the tranquility of Boston's cobblestone streets as evening fell. Claire's bouquet still lay on the office floor, a symbol of a broken hope, while two paramedics carefully situated her on a gurney, telling her to breathe slowly. The spring air, smelling of warm brick and recent rain, entered the building's lobby, but inside the vehicle the dominant scents were disinfectant, the plastic of wrappers, and the intermittent beep of a pulse oximeter marking a rhythm like a stubborn metronome. Claire clenched her teeth as a contraction bit into her lower back and abdomen. Her eyes were wet, not from the pain itself, which she knew well from her work at the hospital, but from the image of the gleaming floor receding and the scattered peonies, as if someone had dismembered the day. Ethan climbed in after her, his expression nervous, a mixture of haste and shame, saying that everything had gotten out of control so suddenly that he never imagined she would get dizzy, that it had been a bad moment. Victoria appeared in the doorway of the building, her face impeccable, her impatience barely concealed, asking if she should come along. One of the paramedics told her to clear the way and gave her a look of weary serenity, the kind only long shifts can produce. The ambulance started with a jolt. Through the window, streaked with raindrops, the city's golden-hued facades blurred into warm lines. Claire closed her eyes, trying to maintain her balance between pain and sorrow. The younger paramedic placed a blood pressure cuff on her arm and noted the numbers, while his partner respectfully placed a hand on her belly and asked about the baby's movements. Her professional voice softened when Claire said she had felt irregular kicks. The paramedic pointed to the monitor and explained they would be at MGH in just a few minutes. Ethan leaned over the gurney and stammered words meant to comfort, but his gaze couldn't find a place to rest. Every time he said Claire's name, it sounded as if he were apologizing for something he didn't yet know how to say. Victoria, who had been leaning against the building's doorframe before the vehicle left, had promised to follow in a taxi and now appeared behind the ambulance, a reflection determined not to fade. Upon arriving at the ER, the gurney was wheeled down a hallway under a white light that admitted no ambiguity. The footsteps of the orderlies echoed on the floor. A medication cart squeaked on a loose wheel. A baby cried from behind a curtain, and a doctor gestured with his chin toward radiology. Claire recognized this familiar music, which had so often found her on her feet in scrubs with a pen, and which now received her lying down as a patient. A brief announcement over the intercom called a doctor to labor and delivery. The wave of chlorine smell mixed with the machine coffee, someone was stirring in a lidded cup. For a moment, the world seemed familiar again. From around the front desk, Dr. David Miller appeared in his white coat, a frown on his face. He was speaking to an assistant, checking a computer screen, and walking with a calm haste, the kind one learns to arrive on time without wasting energy. When he saw the gurney, he froze, but only for half a second. "Claire, my girl," he said, with a softness meant to command the scene. He positioned himself beside her, asked for her vitals, and ordered blood work and fetal monitoring. His eyes, however, after confirming that his niece was stable, found Ethan's and hardened just enough. Victoria appeared behind them with a small purse and an air of belonging that struck David as a critical error in judgment. "What is she doing here, Ethan?" he asked, in the low voice one reserves so as not to add pain where it already abounds. "What Claire needs is calm." Ethan replied that she had just happened to be there, that she came to help, that there was no need to dramatize. David held his gaze long enough to make it clear that this was not a business meeting. Then he turned his head to the triage nurse and asked her to page Megan Rossi if she was on shift. The news spread through the unit like a current of relief. Megan appeared from the hallway in her light blue scrubs, her hair tied back. Upon seeing Claire, she dropped the pack of gauze she was carrying on a counter, sanitized her hands, and approached with that way she had of bringing warmth to a chilled spirit. "Hey, friend, she said without ceremony. She took Claire's hand, wrapping it in both of hers, and in that touch was everything that couldn't fit into an explanation. Claire was able to breathe more deeply. The fetal monitor began to trace a more rhythmic line. Megan asked about the pain, the duration of the contractions, the last checkup. She took mental notes, signaled to an orderly to close the door a little for privacy, and positioned herself on the other side of the gurney so Claire could see a familiar face every time she opened her eyes. The ER's motion continued. Carts came and went. A resident asked for a suction machine, and another pulled out a folder of consent forms. In a nearby chair, an elderly woman waited for news of her grandson. She wore a dark shawl over her shoulders and an old-fashioned purse rested on her knees. A nurse approached and offered her a warm cup of machine coffee with milk. "Thank you, dear," the woman said with that faint old Boston accent that softens the harshness of truth. It was Eleanor Hayes, who had arrived without a sound, notified by someone who preferred not to improvise when family mattered. She held the cup in both hands, as one holds a candle in an unsteady wind, and looked toward the room without any intention of interrupting. The nurse told her they would give her clear news as soon as they could. Eleanor inclined her head and replied that she was in no hurry for the truth. In the adjoining room, David supervised the placement of the cardiotocograph, adjusting the elastic band around Claire's belly with a care that was also a form of apology for not having prevented a prior sorrow. Ethan tried to explain that everything had gone wrong because of a misunderstanding. He spoke to David of results, of contracts, of the inopportune timing of the fainting spell. And the more he spoke, the more evident it became that his words were a wall that couldn't support anyone. Victoria remained standing with her arms crossed, watching the monitor as if she were part of the medical team. Megan kindly asked her to wait outside so as not to crowd the space. Victoria took a few seconds to step back, justifying herself with a sharp smile. She said she just wanted to be available, that in the conference room she had understood she could accompany them if needed. David returned his gaze to Claire and didn't respond. The mere presence of his body between the two women was enough to mark a boundary. As the minutes passed, Claire's pain became more irregular. At times it receded like a wave exposing the sand. At others, it returned with force, squeezing her breath. In each ebb and flow, she looked at Megan and found a guide. She recited to herself the list of things any professional knows to calm incipient panic. Breathe in through the nose, out through the mouth, count the exhalations, remember a safe place. Imagine the Charles River at dawn, silently name the baby, and ask her for patience. Ethan took 2 steps, raised a hand, let it fall, raised it again. He seemed to want to touch Claire and retreat at the same time. Victoria observed from a distance, fiddling with her phone without unlocking it. David spoke with an obstetrician and an anesthesiologist, requesting a quick evaluation. The specialist arrived with a firm stride, greeted Claire by name, and her clear voice brought a provisional certainty that eased the room. The tension, however, was not just clinical. Beneath the sterile language of the hospital, another conversation resonated, one of loyalties and delayed decisions. Claire looked at Ethan and knew there were words that couldn't wait for a medical discharge. In a gesture of fierce humility, she reached for his hand and squeezed it with just enough force to remind him that there were 3 of them, and that one of them, still without a name of her own, needed the other 2 to choose. No one else spoke. Megan lowered her gaze and attended to the equipment. David stood by the monitor like a lighthouse keeper not putting on a show. The obstetrician took a step back to leave the couple that small territory where what matters is sometimes saved or what is broken is declared. Then Claire, through tears that asked not for comfort but for respect, looked at Ethan and said with the voice that comes from the root of the essential, "Choose, your daughter and me, or her." In the hallway, an aide passed with an IV bag and an orderly pushed another gurney that creaked on its axis. A mother cradled her baby with a classic lullaby, and a medical student consulted a manual on his phone screen. In the room, the monitor continued to mark an acceptable cadence. The obstetrician nodded silently, as if listening to music. Megan smoothed a stray lock of Claire's hair with her fingers, a small detail that can sometimes write a universe. David pressed his lips together and breathed through his nose, attentive to the curve that slowly rose and fell again. Eleanor, in the waiting room, carefully blew on the surface of her coffee before taking a sip. She looked at the ceiling for a moment and let the warmth seep into her hands. Ethan remained silent for 3 eternal seconds. In those moments, Claire felt something inside her break, something beyond the physical pain. The murmur of the hospital corridors mixed with the tense voices of the doctors as Claire fought to stay calm. The 3 seconds of Ethan's silence still hung in the air like an unbearable echo, a void that seemed to open beneath her feet every time she closed her eyes. The gurney had stopped at the entrance to the ER, and an orderly asked people to make way. The white fluorescent light fell like a steady rain, and the smell of disinfectant mingled with the humbler aroma of machine coffee being stirred in a plastic cup. A television mounted in a corner showed a local news segment with images of Copley Square and announcements about the upcoming Boston Marathon marching bands rehearsing, streets being prepared, and banners on lampposts. That silent parade on the screen, so uniquely Boston, seemed to promise a world of normalcy that was struggling to arrive in this room. Dr. David Miller appeared with a swift stride, his coat buttoned, a pen in his pocket. Seeing Claire, he approached with a gesture that was part doctor, part uncle. He took her vitals and calmly requested a fetal monitor, basic labs, and for her to be left for a few minutes without unnecessary noise. Claire nodded with a grateful look as she breathed in 4-count breaths to tame the contraction gripping her lower abdomen. Ethan stood beside her with clumsy shame, his fingers interlaced, his shirt buttoned with excessive perfection, as if control depended on it, and he murmured disconnected words that found no place to land. Victoria positioned herself a few steps back, standing with a light-colored purse she never let fall from her forearm, glancing sideways at the monitors as if she could decipher the clinical language through sheer poise. Megan Rossi, paged by a colleague, entered, adjusting her ponytail, and leaned over Claire with natural ease. "Hey, I'm here," she said with a soft smile that brought warmth to the room, and she held Claire's hand with both of hers, so the pulse of one could calm the pulse of the other. David, with that authority that doesn't need to raise its voice, asked about the pain, the frequency of the contractions, the last checkup. As he adjusted the band of the cardiotachograph, he explained to Claire that the baby was being listened to at that very moment, that they had to watch the curves and not jump to conclusions. A rhythmic beat began to mark a gentle rhythm that sounded like music to Claire, and in that chord, she wanted to believe the afternoon could be put back together again. At the door, the receptionist asked if she should bring some water and coffee, and Megan nodded with a grateful gesture that made the place more human. Then, in a whisper that didn't seek to be private, Victoria commented from a distance that Claire always exaggerated a little, that maybe it was all just nerves. She said it without obvious malice, with that social firmness that confuses correctness with truth. 2 nurses exchanged a brief glance. David simply requested silence, and Ethan, who seemed to have heard an involuntary defense of his own disbelief, cleared his throat before sinking back into a silence that hurt. Claire squeezed Megan's hand to keep from responding with words, because she knew that in hospitals, some phrases turn to stone if you don't let them pass. The monitor continued its discreet song. An aide approached with a thin blanket and placed it over Claire's legs with a care that felt like a hug. At that moment, Susan, David's wife, appeared, with a light shawl over her shoulders and the serenity of someone who has seen many hospital corridors and learned not to add weight to the air. She walked toward Claire without haste, smiled tenderly, and upon reaching her, caressed her forehead with her knuckles, as one caresses a daughter. "You're not alone, sweetheart." "Not again," she said in a tone that was both a promise and a shield. Claire sighed and returned an ancient gratitude, the kind that is inherited. Susan looked at Ethan politely and invited him to sit down, to let his breathing find its rhythm. In the waiting room near the television, some families shared murmurs and cups of coffee, and a child, busy with a coloring book, asked why there were runners on TV. The news anchor was talking about the history of the marathon and the preparations. That small narrative in the background provided a sense of company. David, watching the monitor, explained in a low voice that things seemed stable, that they would have to observe. He recommended few stimuli. He asked Victoria to wait outside for a while to allow for privacy, and seeing a barely visible resistance in her posture, he repeated his request with a courtesy that did not admit refusal. Victoria, with a smile that seemed carved from crystal, said there was no problem, that she would be available, and she stepped back 2 paces without completely leaving the doorway. Ethan wanted to say something to mediate between everyone. He stammered a proposal of balance but met Susan's gaze, firm and affectionate, which discreetly indicated that the best thing now was to be present in silence. Megan placed her hand on Claire's shoulder, marking a gentle boundary with her presence. The news segment switched to the weather. They announced clear skies and a mild breeze for the marathon weekend. Someone in the waiting room commented that it was nice to celebrate with good weather. The scene seemed to be settling its pieces. Claire took a sip of water, remembered the hospital corridors from the side of the caregiver, and let memory give words to what she didn't yet dare to say aloud. It was then that Victoria, from the doorway, and with a tone that feigned sensible confidence, looked at Ethan and let a precise sentence fall that weighed more than any diagnosis. "She's just trying to manipulate you with the pregnancy." The sentence landed like a counterfeit coin on a wooden table. Ethan opened his mouth without making a sound. David blinked once before turning completely. Susan brought her fingers to her shawl with the elegance of someone holding a glass so as not to break it, and Megan squeezed Claire's hand so her blood wouldn't run cold. There were no shouts, no dramatic gestures, just a pained stillness that was more eloquent than any protest. David asked Victoria to wait outside this time with unadorned clarity. She retreated with a brief nod. Ethan, as if waking up suddenly, sought Claire's gaze and found in her eyes something more than pain. There was a dignity that demanded respect and time. Claire turned her head toward the monitor, as if she could read the word home in its graph. On the television, they were talking about generations of runners, of families who pass down the tradition, of a community that comes together to support something that gives meaning to the days. Claire thought of her daughter and the need to weave a net around her without any loose threads. David took a deep breath and murmured that they would continue to observe, that for now the baby was doing well, that it was advisable to maintain calm and limit visitors. Susan proposed that when things were more settled, she would bring over some homemade chicken soup that warms the body and also the patience. Megan lowered the bed a couple of inches, adjusted the pillow, and asked Claire to describe the pain as one would describe a tide. Ethan nodded at every phrase with a newfound humility and, for the first time in hours, stayed in his place without trying to justify himself. The tension rose when the monitoring machine emitted an irregular beep. The baby's rhythm was changing. The beep from the monitor became the most feared sound, freezing everyone in the room. Victoria's cruel comment still echoed in Claire's memory, a poison worsening her condition. For an instant, the room seemed to shrink to the exact size of fear. They had moved her from the ER to a private room with ivory-colored walls, a simple, non-denominational print of a landscape hanging by the door, and a bouquet of fresh flowers from the hospital gift shop, perfuming the air with a humble scent that fought to overcome the rubbing alcohol. Soft light entered through the window, drawing a calm stripe across the bedspread, but the monitor beside the bed imposed its law with every trace. Megan moved gently, adjusting the band of the cardiotachograph, holding Claire's hand, guiding her to breathe in 4-count breaths, and looking her in the eyes with that mix of professionalism and affection that gives hope a seat in the midst of turmoil. Ethan stayed close, standing at first, then sitting, his hands clasped as if he were afraid of making a sound just by existing. And every time he looked at Claire's belly, a piece of his pride's armor crumbled. David entered behind them with a steady pace, checked her vitals in a low voice, asked Megan for another blood pressure reading, more labs, and a more prolonged monitoring of the graph. Then he turned to Ethan with the firmest serenity he could muster and asked him how he could have possibly brought his pregnant wife here in this condition. The question hung like a blow from a gavel that demanded no reply, because the reproach was not for show, it was the most direct way to remind him of his duty. Ethan opened his mouth to defend himself. He searched for words like someone searching for coins in an empty pocket and only found a thread of a voice, saying he hadn't thought, that everything had gone wrong, that he wanted to fix it and didn't know where to start. It was then that, In a gesture that irritated the room with its apparent calm, Victoria positioned herself next to Ethan as if she were the legitimate companion, with a posture that claimed a place that was not hers. And that detail, so measured and so clear, provoked the contained indignation of those who know that some silences protect and others murder trust. Megan, who was not one to lose her composure, took a deep breath and focused on Claire. She adjusted her pillow, moistened her lips with a piece of gauze, and with a small gesture, asked her to close her eyes and remember the sound of the Charles River on a calm morning. Claire tried to obey. She felt the tender weight of exhaustion, the capricious pang of a contraction, and through tears that this time were not of panic but of a painful clarity, she caressed her belly with a trembling hand and murmured that her daughter deserved something better than this silence. And the sentence had the solidity of a door being closed to protect what truly matters. The monitor, as if listening, slowed to a less irregular rhythm. David pulled a chair to the head of the bed, placed 2 fingers on Claire's wrist, and encouraged her with a Sunday afternoon voice, the kind that recalls home, the checkered tablecloth, the comforting soup, and promised they would take it step by step, without exaggerating, without minimizing. The room breathed with them for a few minutes. The landscape print by the door seemed to watch without judgment. A ray of sun borrowed the glass of the IV bag and cast a fragment of a rainbow on the wall that played for a few seconds, just long enough for life to slip in between the numbers. Ethan tried again to articulate an apology. He leaned toward Claire, said he was sorry, that he had been an idiot, that he was going to change, that this would end right now. The words piled up like cars at a rotary, going in circles without finding an exit, and David kept his eyes on the monitor so the scene wouldn't become a performance. Megan shot a brief glance at Victoria, one of those looks that don't wound but do command, inviting her to wait outside while they finished stabilizing the patient. Victoria smiled without showing her teeth, a polished gesture that highlighted her lack of empathy, and said there was no need to dramatize, that she only meant to help, that Ethan needed her to manage urgent company business. The sentence hit the ivory wall and fell to the floor like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. David finally raised his head and, in a voice as polite as it was unappealable, reiterated that the priority was his patient's tranquility and that the room needed to be clear. Ethan hesitated for a second and took a step toward the door, but Victoria stood firm, anchored to the idea that her presence was natural. That counterbalance left Ethan in no man's land, too close to her to be a husband, too far from Claire to be a companion. The monitor marked a brief assent that Megan contained with guided breathing and a firm touch on the forearm, the kind of gesture that returns the body to its place. Claire opened her eyes and looked at Victoria, as if looking at the cold reflection of a window in winter. There was no hatred in her gaze. There was an ancient weariness that recalled the wound of all the women who, in a hospital room, have had to lift up their dignity so it wouldn't be swept away by the current of convention. The bouquet of flowers from the gift shop, set in a low vase on the bedside table, released a faint perfume that contrasted with the tension. From the hallway came the sound of the dinner cart, clinking spoons, someone asking for a yogurt, and that everyday murmur served as an anchor. David, who had never been a fan of dramatic phrases, stood up and placed himself between Claire and the rest, not to hide her, but to give her a secure frame. He explained in a practical tone that the baby was sensitive to the environment, that her heart was responding to her mother's emotions, and that therefore they needed serenity. He asked Ethan that if he wanted to help, he should help with actions, and the first was to ask Victoria to leave. Ethan swallowed, looked from one woman to the other, and took a moment to find his position. Finally, he nodded, and in a hushed voice, asked Victoria to leave them for a few minutes. She was slow to react. She placed a light hand on Ethan's arm, which he awkwardly removed. And that small act, seen from the bed, weighed on Claire more than any word. Victoria leaned in slightly, bringing her face close to Claire's with the sweetest smile she could muster. And then, in the center of that theater of monitors and gauze, she let a sentence fall into her ear that drew no blood but left a wound. "You'll never be enough," she whispered, with a contained bitterness that tasted of iron. The air stopped, like water held back by a dam. Megan took a step, intending to place herself between them. David shifted his weight as if ready to intervene. And Ethan looked at Victoria, not understanding the dimension of what had just happened, because some offenses are not measured in the moment, but in the crack they leave forever. Claire breathed. She closed her eyes so that shadow wouldn't enter. She touched her belly again, not with fear, but with a gesture of promise. And there, in that silent pact, she found the strength not to respond with anger. She said, more to herself than to anyone, that love is a house that doesn't admit uninvited guests, and that her daughter would not learn its walls from a place of contempt. Megan breathed in with her and out with her, and the monitor obeyed, docile. David made a mental note of the curve and allowed himself a phrase more human than clinical. He praised Claire's fortitude. He remarked that life is made of persistence, and that to persist well is to learn how to remove the noise. In the hallway, an aide left a pitcher of water and 2 glasses on a cart. From the window, Boston was still Boston, with its red bricks, its afternoon stretching a few minutes longer each day, its murmur of a city that keeps stories without making a sound. Ethan seemed to finally understand that wanting wasn't enough, that he had to choose. He took off his suit jacket as if the uniform of the role he had played for too long had grown heavy. He said he needed to speak with his wife alone, that he apologized to the staff, that they would do whatever the doctor ordered. The sentence was clumsy and sincere, and that mixture was enough for Megan and David to accept it without endorsement. Victoria picked up her purse and took 2 steps toward the door with rehearsed elegance. Halfway there, she turned as if wanting to arrange one last piece of her narrative. And then, a sharp clicking of heels in the nearby stretch of hallway announced a presence that made the air stand at attention. There was the rustle of expensive fabric, the hint of a classic perfume that seemed to bring with it a winter of serious matters, and for a second, time took on the solemnity of decisions that cannot be delegated. The door swung open. Eleanor Hayes, Ethan's mother, appeared, her expression severe. Eleanor Hayes's footsteps echoed on the hospital floor, as if marking an inevitable judgment. Victoria's poisonous whisper still hung in the room, but now a new presence commanded silence. Claire, lying in the bed with the monitor's band strapped to her belly, opened her eyes and felt an unexpected relief at the sight of Ethan's mother. The woman wore a severe but elegant dark suit, her silver hair styled in a firm chignon, her lips pressed into a line that announced she had not come to observe, but to decide. Susan, standing by the bed, inclined her head in a sign of respect, and David crossed his arms with the contained gesture of one who knows that family authority carries a weight as real as any medical report. Ethan looked down, uncomfortable, because he understood what this entrance meant. Victoria, surprised, maintained her erect posture, though a flicker of insecurity appeared in her eyes. Megan, ever attentive, stepped aside, allowing Eleanor to occupy the center of the stage, as befits one who comes to restore a broken order. The hospital room became a silent theater. From the window, a cool spring breeze entered, carrying the damp scent of the Charles River. The contrast between the external calm and the internal tension became more apparent when Eleanor, without a word, advanced to the bed. She observed Claire's pale face for a moment, her contained breathing, the hand resting tenderly on her belly. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, she took her daughter-in-law's hand and held it between her own. "My dear girl, I will not tolerate what has happened here," she said, her voice grave. Her words rose like a wall against the shame that hung in the air. Claire blinked, surprised, and a small sob trembled in her throat, a mixture of relief and release. Ethan tried to intervene, saying the situation was complex, that everything had been misinterpreted, but Eleanor raised a hand firmly and silenced him. "Enough," she declared without raising her tone. And in that one word was the history of many generations who had learned that when family is in jeopardy, excuses are not accepted. Victoria did not surrender. She approached with a determined step, wearing the smile of someone who does not easily accept defeat. She allowed herself a low laugh that sounded hollower than she would have liked. She commented with a mocking air that this was all an exaggerated spectacle, that Claire was using her pregnancy as a shield, that Ethan deserved freedom, and that there was no point in dramatizing. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any shout. Eleanor turned to her and fixed her with a withering gaze. She didn't need long words, just one sentence that landed with the weight of a hammer. In this family, there is no room for lies, nor for those who feed them. Victoria tried to hold her gaze but ended up looking away. Megan discreetly escorted her to the door, reminding her with firm kindness that the priority was the mother's and the baby's health. Victoria walked out into the hallway with hard steps, and the echo of her heels faded until it disappeared, as if the tension itself were dissolving with her absence. The atmosphere gradually eased. Eleanor turned her focus back to Claire and stroked her forehead with an unexpectedly tender gesture. "My grandchild will not grow up surrounded by deceit. From this day forward, you have my protection." Claire couldn't hold back her tears and let them stream down her cheeks. She felt enveloped by a new strength, one that came not from doctors or monitors, but from the decision of a matriarch who had chosen her side. Ethan lowered his head, feeling the weight of his shame. For the first time in years, he felt he was the master of nothing, not his company, not his prestige, not even his words. He understood he had lost something more than Claire's trust. He had lost his mother's as well. That emptiness hit him like an unavoidable truth. David, pleased to see his niece calmer, checked the monitor again and confirmed that the baby seemed stable for the moment. He explained that the important thing was to maintain calm, limit visitors, and let Claire rest. Eleanor nodded with determination and said she would personally ensure that no one disturbed the peace of the room. Susan sat by the bed and spoke of preparing some homemade chicken soup, because nothing is as comforting as the taste of home. Megan, still by Claire's side, whispered for her to breathe with her, and slowly, the beeping of the monitor stabilized. The breeze entered through the window, gently moving the curtains, as if the city wanted to bear witness that life, even in the midst of pain, always finds its course. Eleanor turned to Ethan. Her gaze was severe, but not cruel. In a firm voice, she reminded him that a marriage is not sustained by empty promises, that a family's honor is not a matter of appearances, and that if he wanted to regain his dignity, he had to start by acknowledging his mistake and removing from his life what had caused so much harm. Ethan opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Claire watched him in silence, her eyes holding no resentment, but a clarity that demanded respect. The room fell silent again, broken only by the footsteps of a nurse who entered to adjust the IV drip. She greeted them with a respectful good evening and left again, leaving behind the distant hum of the hallways. In the corridor, some family members murmured about the incident. The news of Eleanor Hayes's arrival had spread among the staff like a small legend, because everyone knew of her character and her influence in Boston society. Claire closed her eyes for a moment and allowed herself to rest. For the first time in many hours, she felt she had a shield around her. It wasn't just the medicine, nor Megan's friendship, nor Susan's tenderness. It was also Eleanor's decision to stand by her, to acknowledge her as a daughter, and to protect her grandchild. That certainty wrapped around her like a warm blanket in the cold. As the afternoon progressed and the sun dipped toward the horizon, the room filled with a golden glow. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the city preparing for the marathon weekend and said in a reflective voice that, in Boston, you always defend your family, even when the truth hurts to admit. Claire heard her and thought that perhaps that simple phrase was the key to understanding everything she was living through. Ethan, sitting in a corner, felt that the judgment had been passed. He didn't need a court or a contract. His mother's words, Claire's silent gaze, and the constant beat of the monitor which reminded him that a life was waiting for justice were enough. Claire, with tears that were now calmer, squeezed Eleanor's hand in gratitude. In that gesture was the promise that, although there was a long road ahead, she was no longer alone. In a firm voice, Eleanor declared, "My grandchild will not grow up surrounded by deceit. From this day forward, Claire has my protection." Ethan lowered his head and, for the first time, admitted, "I've lost more than your trust, Claire." Ethan's silence was more painful than any word. In that instant, Claire understood her worth to him. Eleanor's promise of protection had lit a spark of hope in Claire, but the wound remained open, festering inside her with every contraction that forced her to breathe with effort. The hospital room was in semi-darkness, lit by a soft lamp on the bedside table and the irregular glow of the monitor tracing the baby's heartbeat. Outside, in the corridors, families waited on plastic chairs, some with cups of machine coffee. others skimming local newspapers with stories about the Boston Marathon that was already being prepared for in the city. In this contrast between ordinary life and her intimate storm, Claire found a kind of bitter irony. Ethan remained in the chair by the window, his elbows on his knees, his gaze lost. Victoria hadn't completely disappeared. She was still in the hallway, arguing with an administrator as if she still had the right to decide what happened inside. Eleanor stood, leaning on the back of her daughter-in-law's bed, watchful, with that non-negotiable air of a matriarch. David and Susan remained nearby like silent guardians, and Megan moved around the bed, adjusting IVs and caressing Claire's hand from time to time, giving her an anchor when anguish threatened to pull her under. It didn't take long for Victoria to burst in again, with the firmness of someone who doesn't accept a boundary. She demanded to speak with Ethan. She insisted he needed to show the courage to choose once and for all, that so much ambiguity only served to complicate the situation. Her voice echoed too loudly in the room, and sound unbefitting a place where life was measured in breaths and graphs. Eleanor, with firm calm, confronted her. She reminded her aloud that in Boston, dignity weighs more than ambition, that no family is built on arrogance, and that in their house, there was no space for someone who sowed poison. Victoria laughed sarcastically, accusing them all of forming a hypocritical chorus, and tried to advance toward Claire's bed. It was then that Ethan, on the verge of collapse, stood up. His face was tired, his eyes sunken, and in a threat of a voice, he admitted he had betrayed everyone, including himself. Claire looked at him not with hatred, but with a distance that hurt him more than any insult. It was the distance of someone who no longer expects anything. David moved toward the door, ready to intervene if the situation escalated. And Megan whispered to Claire not to worry, that everything was under control. Victoria refused to give up. She took another step and, in a fit of rage, tried to force her way to the bed, her hand extended as if she could claim a territory that never belonged to her. It was at that exact moment that 2 hospital security guards, previously alerted by David, appeared in the doorway. With professional calm, they asked her to leave. She protested, shouting that it was an outrage, that Ethan needed her, that it was all a conspiracy, but her voice broke against the firmness of the uniforms and the implacable gaze of Eleanor, who didn't take her eyes off her until she saw her in the hallway. Finally, Victoria's footsteps receded, the echo of her heels striking the floor until it was lost in the distance. The door closed, and with that closure, the tension in the room dropped, like when a storm retreats, leaving behind charged air and a silence of relief. Claire breathed more deeply, though fatigue still weighed on her body. Ethan, who had witnessed the scene motionless, sank into the chair with his face in his hands. He understood that he could no longer justify anything, that the silence that had accompanied him until now was a wall isolating him from everything that mattered. Megan refocused on Claire, took her hand again, and invited her to listen to the rhythm of the monitor. She spoke in a low, calm voice, reminding her that every heartbeat was another step toward the baby's safety. Claire closed her eyes and concentrated on that sound, on the constant tapping that told her there was still hope. Susan came closer and smoothed her hair, whispering words of comfort, reminding her that her family was there, that she would not have to go through this pain alone. Eleanor remained upright, observing her son with a mixture of disappointment and compassion. She said nothing more, because sometimes a mother's silence weighs more than 1,000 sermons. David noted the monitor's values and recommended that they let her rest. He spoke of the importance of limiting strong emotions, that mother and child needed to remain calm, but everyone knew those words were also a call for the family to learn to protect Claire, not just from medical risks, but from emotional betrayals. In the hallway, you could still hear the murmurs of visitors and the clinking of coins in the coffee machine. The ordinary life of the hospital went on. Inside, calm was slowly being restored. Claire opened her eyes and looked at Ethan, who was still sunk in his own shame. There were no words between them, only a gaze he couldn't hold. It was the mirror in which he saw his own downfall reflected. Ethan wanted to say something, but his throat closed up. The only thing that came out was a brief sob, a mute confession that acknowledged the magnitude of his loss. Eleanor leaned over Claire, squeezed her hand gently, and told her to rest, that nothing and no one would disturb her peace again as long as she was there. Claire nodded with quiet tears, and that promise was the balm that allowed her to relax enough to be carried away by exhaustion. The rhythm of the monitor stabilized. The city lights came on, casting a golden glow through the window. Outside, Boston was preparing for the marathon festivities. The distant chimes of a church bell sounded like an echo of eternity, a reminder that life goes on, even when hearts feel stopped. Inside the room, Claire closed her eyes again and thought of her daughter. She caressed her tenderly through her belly and promised that no matter what happened, she would fight to give her a home free of shadows. Ethan's silence, though still heavy, was beginning to lose its power against Eleanor's resolve, the support of David and Susan, and the loyalty of Megan. That network enveloped her and gave her back her strength. Victoria, at that point, was just an uncomfortable memory in the hallway. The guards had ensured she wouldn't be back. The tension was dissipating, the baby's heart was beating rhythmically. Claire was breathing more calmly, and the room seemed to have regained a fragile equilibrium. Ethan remained in the corner with his head in his hands, finally understanding that he had to choose between becoming a new man or disappearing into his shame. Eleanor glanced at him, and without needing words, conveyed that the time for neutrality was over. Claire listened to the monitor's heartbeat as if it were her daughter's voice, a small song that restored her certainty of being alive and accompanied. Outside, the day was slowly fading, leaving a sky over Boston of pink and violet hues that promised a new beginning. As Claire listened to the shouts from her bed, she placed a hand on her belly and whispered, "Hold on, my little one. The storm is almost over." The sound of the monitors set the pace of hope as the doctors raced against the clock. Victoria's shouts still echoed in Claire's memory, but the focus now was on saving the baby. The room became a hub of urgency, a space where every gesture carried weight. A nurse burst through the door with a cart of instruments. Another alerted the OR for premature births, and an orderly positioned Claire's gurney for immediate transfer. The air smelled of disinfectant and latex. In that smell, Claire recognized a territory she had navigated many times as a professional, but which now received her from the other side, as a patient. Megan held her hand during the journey, leaning close to her ear to remind her to breathe slowly, that the baby was listening and needed her calm. Claire pressed her lips together, closed her eyes, and in the midst of the pain, thought that she had to stay strong. She would do it for herself and for the daughter she carried in her womb. Ethan followed with the hesitant steps of someone who has lost his way, his hands open and his voice trembling, repeating that everything would be all right, though he didn't believe it himself. The operating room received her with an intense, white, almost blinding light. The surgical lamps hung like artificial suns, and the shadows of the doctor's hands moved with precision over the surgical field. David took control of the situation, ordering vitals, calling for light anesthesia, and requesting that an incubator be prepared in the NICU. The team moved in perfect coordination, like a silent orchestra with a language made of glances and gestures. Claire felt cold as she was moved from one bed to another. The clean sheet against her skin reminded her of the fragility of the moment. A nurse placed electrodes on her chest. Another gently held her arms. Ethan, in a green cap and disposable gown, stood at the edge of the room, too close to ignore the pain, too far to be a real part of it. Eleanor and Susan waited in an adjacent room, praying silently. And Megan, authorized by David, remained in the OR to accompany Claire because she knew that the presence of a friend could be as therapeutic as any medication. The doctors announced that the baby needed to be born now to survive. The decision allowed no delay. Claire, with tears in her eyes, asked them to save her daughter first. Her voice came out clear and firm, like a command. Ethan wanted to intervene, to say they should protect her too, but the force of Claire's words left him speechless. In that instant, he understood the magnitude of his wife's bravery. She was willing to sacrifice herself, while he had hidden so many times behind cowardly silences. David looked at her tenderly and promised they would fight for them both. The sound of a scalpel slicing through sterile gloves, the murmur of commands, the beep of the monitor, it all became a grave hum that marked the countdown. Time lost its shape. For Claire, each second stretched as if it were a minute. She remembered the hospital corridors, the faces of the mothers she had comforted in her job, the words she had so often spoken to calm them. Now, those words came back to her like an echo. Megan whispered for her to think of a meadow in Vermont in the spring, of the light on the fields, of the smell of fresh bread. Claire smiled faintly. She imagined her daughter running through Boston Common, holding her hand, and in that image, she found strength. The scalpel moved with precision. The team responded swiftly. A thick silence settled for a few seconds that seemed eternal. Then, they heard the baby's first cry, a fragile but powerful sound that filled the room with tears and relief. The doctor lifted the newborn, tiny and covered in the vernix of new life, and carefully handed her to the nurse who took her toward the incubator. The cry became a brief, irregular but firm song, and that sound drew sighs from everyone in the room. Ethan wept silently in the corner, covering his face with his hands. Claire, exhausted, barely turned her head and asked if she was alive. Megan replied with an emotional voice that yes, she was strong, that she was breathing on her own. David brought his hand close to Claire's, and with a weak gesture, she reached for it. Tears streamed down her temples, but a smile of gratitude formed on her face. The team was still working to stabilize the mother, closing the incision delicately, controlling her blood pressure, ensuring there was no major hemorrhage. Claire felt the weight of the light anesthesia and the lightness of having fulfilled her promise. She murmured that the baby was her new reason for living. No one in the room forgot that sentence. Megan leaned in and stroked her hair, reminding her that she still had to recover. Ethan, with trembling steps, finally approached. He asked for permission with his eyes, and David gave a cold nod. Ethan leaned down and told Claire he was sorry, that he had been blind, that he wanted to be worthy of them. Claire didn't answer. She pressed her lips together and let the silence speak. The monitor marked a stable rhythm, and that was the only answer she needed for now. In the next room, Eleanor received the news that her granddaughter had been born. She put a hand to her chest, quietly thanked God, and hugged Susan, who was crying openly. The hospital corridor filled with a murmur of joy, as if everyone waiting there had shared in the victory. Claire, inside the OR, heard her daughter's cry again, and felt her soul light up. She asked to see her, even if just for a moment. The nurse approached with the tiny baby wrapped in a white blanket. Claire raised a weak hand, and for the first time caressed her daughter's minuscule hand. The contact was brief but eternal. In that caress, a silent promise was sealed. As Claire caressed her daughter's tiny hand for the first time, she thought, "She will be my new reason for living." The news of the birth spread through the family like a sunrise after an endless night. The baby's cry had sealed a new chapter, but the past still weighed like a shadow in the hospital room. Claire, exhausted but radiant, rested in bed with her daughter in her arms. The little girl slept wrapped in a white blanket, breathing with the delicate rhythm of miracles. The room, with a view of the Charles River, was filled with the soft morning light, and the bedside table was crowded with flowers sent by neighbors and family. The scent of carnations, mixed with the aroma of homemade chicken soup, a neighbor had brought the previous evening as a sign of support, a gesture as American as a neighborhood potluck. Ethan stood awkwardly, a bouquet in his hand, unsure whether to approach or wait. His eyes, swollen from lack of sleep, and his subdued voice revealed a different man, aware of his failings and his need to rebuild. Eleanor, sitting in an armchair by the bed, watched him in silence. There was no harshness in her gaze, but there was a severe expectation, that of a mother demanding accountability and change from her son. David and Susan moved discreetly about the room, arranging flowers, placing a pitcher of water, and ensuring Claire didn't overexert herself. The atmosphere was a mixture of tenderness and tension. Ethan took a step toward Claire and spoke in a low voice. He admitted he had failed as a husband, that he had hurt her where it mattered most, but that he wanted to be a worthy father, that he wanted to learn to protect his daughter as he had never protected his wife. Claire listened in silence, stroking the baby's head, and didn't respond immediately. She was a tired but lucid woman, and she understood that words were not enough. Eleanor intervened serenely. "Second chances aren't begged for," she said. "They're earned." The sentence hung in the air like a beacon. Ethan lowered his head and acknowledged that his mother was right. He explained that he had decided to start therapy, that he would sell part of his company to partner with a local foundation supporting at-risk pregnant women. He said he couldn't repair what he had done, but he could try to build something useful for others. The confession surprised everyone. David, who had just entered to check on Claire's clinical progress, looked at him skeptically, but nodded when he saw his nephew speaking with a different kind of sincerity. Claire, still silent, felt that there was at least an attempt. The day passed with brief visits. Neighbors arrived with simple gifts: tiny baby clothes, flowers, homemade cookies. An elderly woman, a friend of Eleanor's, came with a small silver rattle, and another brought a bouquet of lilacs from her own garden. The community, so present in Boston life, seemed to wrap Claire and her daughter in a collective embrace. Ethan remained on the sidelines, greeting people shyly, not claiming any spotlight. With each visitor, Eleanor introduced Claire first, making it clear to everyone that she was the center, the brave mother who had protected the little one with her life. Ethan understood that he had to start from scratch, without claiming rights he had lost. Claire watched him out of the corner of her eye, and though her gaze held no hatred, it held no immediate indulgence either. In the afternoon, when the room was quieter, Ethan approached again. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands nervous, and asked Claire not to shut him out completely, to give him a chance to prove his change with actions. She took a deep breath and, with serenity, replied that she wasn't closing the door, but she would no longer open it with the same keys. The sentence was a soft but firm wall. Ethan fell silent, accepting that he couldn't force anything. Eleanor, who had overheard, nodded in satisfaction. Megan smiled knowingly at Claire, recognizing in that response the strength of a woman who had found herself again. The baby woke with a brief cry. Claire settled her in her arms, sang a soft lullaby, and kissed her forehead. In that gesture was all the hope for a new future. Susan came over and offered to help rock her, and together they took turns as if they were guardians of a treasure. David confirmed that the recovery was going well, that mother and daughter were out of immediate danger, and recommended a few more days of rest before going home. The news filled the room with relief. Ethan, in silence, promised to be there every day, even if it was just to sit quietly, learning anew how to be present. Claire looked at him serenely, offering neither an affirmation nor a rejection, letting time mark the path. As evening fell, the city lights twinkled on. From her window, Claire could see golden reflections on the Charles. She thought about how life continued, how every chime from a distant church clock reminded her that the hours passed without stopping, and how her daughter would be a witness to that continuity. Ethan stood up, collected the empty glasses, and helped Megan tidy the table. They were small gestures, but they revealed a change. Claire watched him and understood that perhaps, with patience, time would tell if that change was real. The baby calmed down and fell asleep again, and peace settled in the room. In the silence, Ethan leaned in one last time and promised he would start therapy the next day, that he would sell a part of the company and support the foundation, that he would work every day to be a different man. Claire, serene, listened. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. There was a distance, but also a crack left open. In that crack lay the hope of a rebuilt family, as long as the effort was genuine. As Ethan promised to start therapy and change his life, Claire looked at him without smiling, leaving a silence charged with uncertainty. The streets of Boston filled with banners, music, and crowds as the city celebrated the marathon. Claire remembered her daughter's first cry as a miracle and her family's promise as a shield. A few weeks had passed since the birth, and her recovery was progressing patiently. That morning, the city was alive. The finish line on Boylston Street gleaming, the brownstones of Back Bay adorned with flags, and a festive air mixing with the scent of street food and blooming flowers. Claire walked slowly, her daughter in her arms, wrapped in a light blanket. The sun lit up the historic facades, and the roar of the crowd surrounded them like friendly music. By her side were Eleanor, upright and proud, David and Susan, with calm smiles, and Megan, always watching over the baby. Ethan accompanied them a few steps behind, silent, humble, not imposing himself, aware that he had to re-earn every gesture of trust. Claire felt him nearby, but the shadow of resentment no longer weighed on her. Instead, she felt the duty to protect what she had learned to value, the strength of a united family. The race was in full swing. Elite runners had already crossed the finish line, but thousands more were still on the course, a river of humanity flowing through the city. The sound of cheering mixed with the broadcast from loudspeakers and the distant wail of sirens. Claire watched her daughter, who slept peacefully despite the noise, and felt that this festive atmosphere was the perfect setting to seal a new chapter. People came up to congratulate her. Some neighbors commented on how strong she looked after everything she had been through. Others leaned in to look at the baby and smiled tenderly. Eleanor accepted every kind word on behalf of the family, repeating with pride that the little girl was a gift from heaven. Claire absorbed it all with serenity, feeling no need to explain anything more. She felt that her strength was not in words, but in the simple fact of being there, with her daughter alive and in her arms. Ethan walked a few steps behind, his hands clasped behind his back. He watched Claire and the baby with a mixture of nostalgia and hope. He remembered his mistakes, the silences that had wounded more than any words, and understood that the distance separating them was still great. He didn't try to close it abruptly. He preferred to observe and wait. Whenever Claire stopped to adjust the baby's blanket or to receive a greeting, he remained to one side, attentive, ready to help if she asked. It was a new role for him to be present without imposing, and although it hurt, it was also a lesson. Eleanor watched him out of the corner of her eye, measuring his every move, waiting to see consistency between his promises and his actions. David and Susan exchanged glances, pleased to see Claire strong and surrounded by support. The crowd erupted as a local runner approached the finish. Spectators waved banners, and the cheer became a unified roar. Claire felt a lump in her throat. She caressed her daughter's head and lifted her slightly so the sunlight could reflect on her face. She thought about how close they had been to losing her, about the fear that still chilled her skin when she remembered the premature contractions, and how life was now gifting her this image of her baby, breathing peacefully. Eleanor placed a hand on her shoulder and said in a low voice, "That family isn't perfect, but it's always stronger than deceit." Claire nodded, tears in her eyes. Megan smiled and murmured that this little girl had arrived to change everything. Susan, emotional, took out a small, embroidered handkerchief and gently placed it over the baby's head, as if to bless her with an intimate gesture. Ethan took a step forward. He didn't dare to interrupt, but leaned in discreetly to whisper, "Maybe one day, you'll forgive me completely." Claire didn't answer. She looked toward the finish line, listened to the swell of the crowd, and let those voices fill the silence. She knew that forgiveness was a long road, and that she had to protect herself and her daughter above all else. She wasn't closing the door, but she wasn't throwing it wide open either. Eleanor observed in silence, approving of her prudence. It was the first sign that Ethan was beginning to understand that his redemption would not be achieved with words, but with years of consistency. When the wave of cheering subsided, Claire rejoined the rhythm of the crowd. She walked through the square, surrounded by neighbors waving flags, children running with balloons, and elderly people clapping from their folding chairs. Every corner of the city seemed to vibrate with joy. And in that atmosphere, Claire found the certainty that a new chapter had begun. She looked at her daughter and thought that her greatest task now was to teach her to recognize the truth, to accept nothing less than respect, to grow up surrounded by pure love. David and Susan walked beside her, proud. Megan took photos with her phone, capturing simple moments. Claire smiling, the baby asleep, Eleanor looking up at the decorated buildings. The afternoon wore on, and the crowds grew even larger. The cafes with sidewalk patios were overflowing with people. Cups of coffee and glasses of iced tea circulated amid laughter and conversation. Claire allowed herself to sit for a moment on a patio with the baby in her arms and savored a sip of cold water that a waitress kindly served her. Eleanor ordered an espresso. Susan chose a lemonade. David preferred a local IPA. Ethan remained standing, waiting, and when the waitress asked what he wanted, he replied, "Just water." It was a minimal gesture, but in it, Claire perceived his willingness to step down, to accept that he was no longer the center of attention. The waitress left the check on the table, and Eleanor left a generous tip, with a thank you that sounded solemn. As another group of runners passed, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and triumph, Claire stood up. She held her daughter up toward the blue sky that stretched over Boston, a symbol of rebirth and hope. The golden light illuminated the baby's face and drew spontaneous applause from some neighbors who were moved by the scene. Claire felt time stop in that gesture. The baby opened her eyes for just an instant, and then closed them again with the peace of one who knows she is protected. Ethan watched Claire with moist eyes and murmured to himself, in a voice barely audible, "Maybe one day, you'll forgive me completely." Claire didn't hear him, or chose not to. She focused on the warm weight of her daughter, on the promise she had made in the operating room, on the certainty that life had given her a second chance. As music filled the square, Claire walked with a firm step, surrounded by her family, embraced by the community of her city. Boston shone during the marathon, and she knew that this day would be etched not only in the city's history but also in her own. The story of a woman who had faced betrayal, weathered the storm, and now held up her daughter as the emblem of a new future. As the procession of runners passes before them, Claire lifts her daughter toward the blue sky, a symbol of rebirth and hope. While the music fills the square, Ethan watches Claire and murmurs, "Maybe one day, you'll forgive me completely." In the memory of Boston, that marathon morning remains suspended like a painting of light and silence. Claire lifted her daughter toward the blue sky, surrounded by the crowd, and in that simple gesture lay the answer to all she had suffered. The music from the street performers, the confetti falling, and the roar of the square were witnesses to a rebirth that belonged not just to one family, but to hope itself. There they all were, marked by mistakes and absences, but also transformed by the certainty that true love is not measured in empty promises, but in acts that restore dignity. The wound of the past did not disappear entirely, but it had begun to scar over with the tenderness of a mother and the protection of those who chose to stand by her side. The lesson this story leaves us is clear and profound. Life always offers us the opportunity to make amends, even when the path seems broken. Love does not erase what happened, but it grants the strength to rise and move forward. Family, with all its imperfections, is the refuge where we find the courage to admit our faults and the comfort to learn to forgive. Like the Charles River, which follows its serene course despite the storms, our hearts can also find a new channel when they decide to return to what is essential. He who dares to ask for forgiveness and to care for his own discovers that no defeat is final. And she who knows how to welcome and protect, as Claire did with her daughter and as Eleanor did with her daughter-in-law, understands that true power lies in sustaining life when it seems most fragile. In the end, like a lamp lit in a window during the night, a gesture of love can guide us through the darkest moments and remind us that we are never truly alone. Dear listener, perhaps in your own life there are wounds waiting to be healed or silences that deserve to be filled with simple words. Perhaps there are people around you who need a gesture of tenderness to feel that they still belong. Stop for a moment and think about the value of those silent presences, of the strength of the bonds that sustain us even when the world seems to be falling apart. And if this story has touched your heart, share it with someone who you think might find in it a ray of comfort, because by sharing stories of hope, we keep the flame of what makes us human alive, the capacity to love, to repair, and to build together a home where truth and tenderness always have the final word.